So today we're going to talk about don't question Israel. I think this is an important topic to talk about with all the censorship we've been hearing about, how if you go against talking about Israel, that you're going to get deplatformed. There's the takeover of TikTok and X and all these things. Let's go into a little breakdown of some stuff. So this is where we kind of started. Who are paying influencers $7,000 per post to talk about how there's no genocide going on in Israel? And this is Israel paying $7,000 per post. This is kind of like when they were telling people to take the boosters in 2020 and they're paying the influencers to do that. Now we have it just doing it the opposite side. So that's the first part. And there's tons of influencers on this bandwagon. You see them on social media all the time. Then we move over to the owner of Israel, whoever he may be, whatever his name is. But he talks about how they're going to use TikTok and X to talk about how there's no genocide going on. And they're talking about how they want to buy TikTok and then they want to buy X, which would then give Israel the control over all of the social media in the world. Kind of like what Henry Ford used to talk about in the 1920s, which is interesting. Then we go into all of the presidents. They're all bought and paid for. All of our Muppets are all paid for, and they've been paid for a long period of time. And this is just an example people can look into all the people going and kissing the wall. And it's interesting because Henry Ford wrote about this in 1921. So people are aware. A Jewish superpower. And people should look into his book. It is mind blowing. Every single thing that we see today, Henry Ford wrote about it in 1921. So think about that. Then we go into the whole thing with the FBI and how they're allegedly cutting ties with the Defamation League. This is interesting because the Defamation League was the one who brought the FBI in, and that's with Herbert Hoover, which we're going to talk about next. So even though they're cutting the ties, it doesn't really change much. But people can look into this one. This is the work of Eustace Mullins, and he talked about the FBI right here. And after he started exposing everything, that's why I love his work so much. Guess who came after him? The FBI, because he started speaking the truth and showing how there was the ADL was connected to the Zionists and the Bolsheviks and the communists. Now, what's also interesting is in the same period, you got Rubio over here talking about how we should have a bill to take away people's passports so they can't travel if they decide to criticize Israel. That's kind of like in Europe right now, where if you challenge the Holocaust, you go to jail. If you ask a question about an event in which you were lied to, you go to jail. Kind of strange. Then we saw the whole thing with Charlie Kirk. He started questioning things, and we know what happened with that situation. Then you go on to Reddit, start questioning things about Israel. Same exact thing. You get deleted and banned. And then you have the leader again talking about how it's a conspiracy theory, that they're trying to control the media and trying to do everything. That's how mind blowing and how much they lie out of their teeth to the people. Then you go into the whole thing with MAGA and how you got the influencers getting paid by Israel to go over there. 16 influencers flown out there. America first, huh? Then you got everything related to Charlie Kirk questioning Israel, getting taken down, so people can learn about that. Then you get into this one. Israel talks about how, they're just allegedly taking out terrorists, but then when you go to the Jewish virtual library down on the bottom, you see that it says we may have made a couple mistakes. And it dates back to 1956. So they've been taking out people for a long period of time. Then you go into the leader again. He's saying, good words, but he says Charlie Kirk never actually came back. I wonder why. He might have put things together. Then you go into the whole thing with the three-letter agencies so people can understand how long this has been going on for. So this says CIA.gov, darker side of the U.S.-Israeli ties revealed. Interesting. You can kind of see the connection of our government. Then you go into the Protocols of Zion, which I highly recommend everybody check this out. This is kind of like their booklet that they kind of, pride themselves on. So economic wars, we all know that. Re-education, controlling the educational system, Rockefellers and Rothschilds. Control of the press, that's what Henry Ford wrote about. They controlled all the newspapers and the New York Times and all the different things that they published into the newspapers to, control the people and then pin them against each other. Loans and credit and the power of gold. Gold is the counter towards our system, and that's why they took it off In 1933, they said, no more gold. We can't have that backing the currency. And that is because gold is the counter towards a system that is based on debt and leads to slavery. So then we move over here, we go to the next one. There you go. You got good old Nixon saying about how our government's been bought and paid for a long time. And Nixon didn't really kind of go with the playbook, so they kind of nixed him out. And then you also see the Congress down here, all bought and paid for, just visiting. That's what they tell you. Protocols of Zion, this was interesting. It talked about the chosen people. They believe they're the chosen people, yet they also believe they should destroy all other religions. That doesn't sound very chosen to me. Then you go into this whole situation. 1492, 300,000 Jews are expelled from Spain for stealing all the gold and destroying Spain's economy. And somehow they end up in America with Columbus. I guess that was also kind of left out of the school system. Then we move over to the term melting pot. I always heard that one growing up in school. People were like, oh, it's a melting pot. America's a melting pot. Yeah, when you get into the Bolsheviks and the Zionists and the communists, they came up with that term to make us be brainwashed, to make us believe that we should all just kind of mesh together. And that's also to kind of destroy lineage and nationalism as well. Then you go into slavery. This was a really interesting one. You know, we always heard about who started to bring the slaves and whatever else, but then we didn't hear about how Henry Ford talked about how the Jewish people were bringing in the slaves, and they had lots and lots and lots and lots of slaves, and they controlled the slave trade because since they were here since 1492, they controlled a lot of the trade and the merchants' routes. So you can kind of see that, and the whole red light district right here, that's actually where that came from. So same thing. Then we move over to Albert Pike. Albert Pike talks about how the war of World War II would be between the fascists and the Zionists. So Germany, Italy, Japan, and most of the Middle East, and India, and Pakistan, and I mean, I can name a whole bunch of other countries who were on the German side, were actually fighting up against the Zionists. And the Zionists still own this state today because if you think about it, this is where the whole Israel came from, and Palestine, and them basically trying to take over their land and say that it's now our land. And it says during the Second World War, international communism must be strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which we can go into that next. And then we go into people where they say, oh, you know, the Germans were up to no good. Really, Judea declares war on Germany. We want to bring them into deep hatred for the Germans, the German soldiers, the sailors, the airmen. We must hate until we win. That's how they think. And then the declaration called the war against Germany, which is now considered the Holy War. And if you go into this document of Judea declares war on Germany and you read what is said, the words that are said, it really shows you a different story of World War II, which you were lied to about. Then you go into the whole thing with Germany arresting bankers right here, arresting bankers who were wrecking the country. That was the threat. So what Germans were doing were arresting the Rothschilds because they realized that the Rothschilds were wrecking their economy. Bread was so expensive that it would take like $100,000 to get a piece of bread, which you can only imagine what that would do to your economy. Prostitution, gambling, and all of these things run rampant in Germany after World War I because they decimated the economy. And this was done by the bankers, Rothschilds. And so when people were revolting, such as Hitler and Germany, they were getting rid of the bankers and saying, we don't want this banking system here anymore. That's screwing us. That ties back to the Federal Reserve. And so when you think about kind of what we see today, you know, with like food prices and housing and all this stuff is so expensive, ties back to the bankers. Bankers control everything. Then we move over to World War II stats because, you know, a lot of this is always left out. They don't give you the real stats of anything. They broadcasted the number 6 million for about the first 20 years from I think it's like 1915 to 1939. They just kept putting 6 million in the New York Times. Like even if it was just 6 million pieces of gold, 6 million that, so that people already have that number ingrained into their mind. But when we look at the Red Cross stats, which actually Red Cross is owned by the Rothschilds, we see a number down there that says 271,000. That was the stat that they had. So that's kind of a very big different number than 6 million. And that number has been revised many times. And this is the part that's, once again, always left out. And then we are also leaving out the part about all of the Christians which were taken out in World War II. That is 90 million. 90 million. Think about that. That is not even close to any of the numbers that you've been told in school and with movies and whatever else in Hollyweird, because that's also owned by the same people. And if we notice the population right here, we also see that the Jewish population actually increased, which makes no sense. And then there's also the Eisenhower death camps. So most people don't know about that one. Those were American camps in Germany. And for record, so people have more numbers, because I really like numbers, is we see a population change right here, and it's not that significant when you start to look at it. And it's interesting because this book, it's the World Book of Facts, an almanac. It actually was revised in the 1960s and 70s. So it wasn't revised while the truth was coming out, it was revised after. And that's kind of how they always do it. They always revise things after. Then we get into the whole Magnus Herschel thing. Most people don't know that the whole LGBTQ 47, whatever it may be, that's what all pushed by Magnus Herschel. He was a Jewish fellow, and that's who the books that were getting burned in Germany, remember that when people were burning the books? That was his books and his library, because people did not agree that this was not very German to have books that are telling people that they have to be multi-genders and all of that. And that's another part that's left out. You see people burning books, but they don't say the books that they were actually burning. And then now we see today, 2025, mass confusion where children should never be learning any of this nonsense, but this is being pushed by the school system, teaching them about this nonsense. And so, same exact playbook. Then you go into here, Berlin was a hotbed of just basically cross-dressers and transsexuals until the Germans came to power. And this was because once the country was destroyed, prostitution and gambling went rampant, which was also brought in by the Zionists. A lot of bad things coming from the Zionists. And then this kind of digs it a little deeper. Magnus Herschel. He was the first person to coin transvestite, promoting gender-affirming procedures, and best friends with Margaret Sanger. Who is Margaret Sanger, you might ask? The Planned Parenthood CEO. And she wrote some really interesting books about hurting people a lot, with her whole entire agenda, and culling a lot of the population, which people can look into her work. And then her Bill Gates is also supported by Planned Parenthood. You see how all three of these kind of connect? They always connect to each other. And then here's what the whole situation of Israel, when it all started, the stolen situation. You have the Rothschilds, who are Zionist Jews, and they are talking about how they are going to create a new state, and that is going to be called Israel. And they're going to take that away from the Palestinians, and that will be soon theirs. Now, what's interesting is this document talks about peace, but we don't see any peace now at all, actually. Then you want to get into some books and documentaries so you can kind of just open your mind. You get into the Lucha Report, which was a fellow who went to the Canada Parliament and protested the whole thing with the Holocaust and showed how there was no gas in the gas chambers. And he won in court. So that's a really interesting one. And he's got tons and tons. He was attacked. You get into Europa, the Last Battle. It is a about 12-hour documentary, which will blow your mind, on the other side of World War II. You can also look into The Greatest Story Never Told, another phenomenal one. Then we go into The Curse of Canaan, which is by Eustace Mullins, talks about the Canaanites. So when we get into the Bolsheviks, when we get into the communists, when we get into the Phoenicians, the Venetians, the Canaanites, the Charzarians, the Karzarians, they have all different names, but they're all the same people. They've been kicked out of 109 different countries. So when you get into The Curse of Canaan, that kind of breaks it all down. And then Zionism, also by Eustace Mullins, The Terrible Secret of the Cold War. And that's another one. Stalin and all of the stuff that was happening with Stalin, and then all the stuff that was happening with Mao in China, is some pretty nuts stuff to look into. If you haven't looked into that to see what was actually taking place with Stalin and Mao, it's mind-blowing. And then when you go into the Bolsheviks, which were the Zionist Jews who took over Russia, and how they pretty much there was a genocide against the Russian people because they took away all their gold. That's another one to look into too. And then this was an interesting one that I found. Holocaust survivor who spends decades lecturing school children about Auschwitz admits he made up his stories and never was a prisoner after being caught in his lies. He also faked his tattoo. And what's crazy is his reparations have been given to Israel for the last 50 years when you start to think about this. And imagine getting money for something that you made up. And then you're telling people stories that you made up as well. And so where's the justice in that? This was an interesting one too. This was G. Edward Griffin. This is probably one of the best quotes you will ever read with about communism. And it says in 1943, the following directive was issued from a party headquarters to all communists in the United States, because our country is communist. It read that certain obstructionists become too irritating, label them after suitable buildups as fascists, Nazis, and anti-Semitic. So before anybody goes on that rant about saying that you're fascist, Nazi, or anti-Semitic, you're using that communist tactic to brainwash the people. The association will, after enough repetition, become the fact in the public mind. And that's what they use. They always use that term. If it's not fascist, it's Nazi. If it's not Nazi, it's anti-Semitic. And they just keep repeating it until you feel maybe guilty for talking about questioning things, which what we're doing today. And here you go. This is just a great document I found on the Jewish Museum in London. So it's right there. Talks about how the Dutch and the Jewish involvement in the transatlantic slavery. And remember, the Dutch also connect back to the Jewish involvement as well, too. You kind of connect them in between. It's a very interesting thing when you go into who controls all the merchants and the waters. And when you control the merchants and the waters, you control the world. Then this was an interesting one, General Leroy Lutz of the U.S. Army. And this was what was happening. After World War II, the U.S. Army and military was realizing that they fought the wrong enemies, that the enemy was actually within. And this came from many different people. And his quote was, "I am informed that the Germans did not loot either residences, stores, or museum. In fact, the people claimed that they were meticulously treated by the Army of Occupation." So what happened was after World War II, they started looting everything and destroying it and stealing it and then blaming it on the Germans coming in. And then also with the whole thing with the bells, that's when they destroyed all the bells too. Because the bells held, you get into this, you got sound healing, number one. And number two, they had a lot of old world languages written on them. This was interesting too. This goes into no Palestinian state. The place is ours. So the leader of Israel says it doesn't exist, which when you go on maps before the 1940s, it always existed. So they're just saying that it will be theirs. And this is what happens in war. You know, you got places like even like Bohemia, which completely vanish after World War II, or after a certain war, countries just vanish and then they just get taken away. These are things to look into for people to read more, because you got to really understand this. This is The Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins. This is a phenomenal one. This is the one that blew my mind. It made me realize that all sides are the Federal Reserve. You had Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat in 1913, who pushed the Federal Reserve, and you had Nelson Aldrich, who was a Republican, who pushed the Federal Reserve. So both sides were going to screw the people, and it's important for people to be aware of this. And then you have Congressman McFadden on the Federal Reserve Corporation from 1934. This is just a simple pamphlet. It's like 20 pages, and it's so in depth, it's nuts, so that you can understand our whole money system. You know, printing money. It's a credit system is what it really is. And that's why you have to think about, like, they print debt notes to try to solve the debt. How does that make any sense? How can you take a debt note and solve the debt with debt? You can't. So kind of understand why debt keeps going up. This was another one from Secrets of the Federal Reserve. This was with Eustace Mullins. This was Who Owns the Schools? So this gets interesting. So the Peabodys are connected to J.P. Morgan. And then you also have John D. Rockefeller, who's funded by the Rothschilds and funded by the Oppenheimers. So when you get into your whole schooling system, you know, you get 18 years of brainwashing. And then if you do additional years, you get brainwashed a little bit more. You got bankers and oil tycoons owning the school system. So this is why people aren't learning anything of the truth. They learn a bunch of nonsense, and they're brainwashed into becoming just sad and a victim, I would say, because that's what they try to teach people to be. And then this is interesting too, because, you know, people go, oh, well, Israel is our ally. Really? Well, the untold story of Israel's deadly 1967 assault on a U.S. spy ship. So they knew that our ship was over there, and they still destroyed it anyways. So you have to wonder if they will destroy us, like our own ships, why won't they destroy our country? And this is the thing, is they love their country. They don't love America. They have Israel first, not America first. And that's what people have to realize. Like a lot of people, when you get into dual citizenship, you got dual citizenship because you want to go somewhere else or you want to support somewhere else. You're not loyal, in my opinion. This was the Lucha report. So people can look into this, The End of the Myth. And his book is phenomenal. It was mind blowing when I went through all of this. And it's wild too, because I actually visited Auschwitz back in the day. And, they show you all like the shoes and the hair and all this other stuff. And, it's really playing on your emotions is what they're trying to do. And that's what he explained. The Lucha report, he explained that. And he won in court. So people are aware. This was just more quotes. Judea declares war on Germany, and just more quotes. And it's interesting because they're talking about the Gentiles in here. So a Jew and a Gentile, and there's actually a difference. So the Jew believes that they are above us, and then the Gentile is everything below. But it says in here this one quote, and this was in the New York Times, which is owned by Judea, so or the Zionist Jews as well too. But it says right here, each of you, Jew and Gentile alike. So they're trying to pair us together, you get it? But in reality, they believe in the supremacy over us. And this is really important. Like people can just look at these quotes. And it also talks about right here, President Wilson and Roosevelt and how all of them were connected to Judea and Israel and this whole thing. And most people don't know this. Like you don't realize this. And the other reason that America went into World War II, just so you're aware, most people were protesting at the time because they didn't want to be in war because they already saw what happened with World War I and they didn't agree with it. But World War II, the reason America was put into the war was because America put an oil embargo on Japan, and that caused Japan to attack. And that's what led America into the war because Japan was going to run out of oil and they couldn't function without oil. So when they put this oil embargo on them, they were put in a pinch and they had to end up attacking America. And that got us right in. And then the bankers could make money on both sides. More quotes here. You got into the whole thing. Hitler will have no more, have no war, does not want war, but we will force him into it. Not this year, but soon. That's in June of 1934. So you can see how things are set up and pushed and planned out. Just like we weren't supposed to go into World War I right away until the bankers said we should be in World War I. So people should be aware of this. And the military, I hate to say, is used as pincushions and they just put boosters and injections and all kinds of chemicals into them. That's a whole nother topic, which the book, The Poison Needle, for people to look into. This was another interesting one. And I found the old world right here. This kind of blew my mind. And it talks about the Jews of the old world, which I've talked about the old world in America and how it's been destroyed. And all these old world buildings have been destroyed. And now it tied back into when I read this in Henry Ford, it blew my mind because I started thinking this has been going on for a very long time. They're destroying the old world of Europe, then they're destroying the old world of America, and then they're destroying all the other countries. That's the whole point of like invading countries. It's to destroy the old world, get the new world system in there with like AI, social credit scores, and all this stuff. This was another interesting one. I mean, this is how twisted this is. It says literally in the memory of Charlie Kirk, and he's got a missile in his hand. Like they're just going to blow people up. Sick is what it is. And then this is the nukes, because I think this is such an important topic. Fake nukes to justify endless wars. Every single time you hear about them invading a country and saying they're going to invade this country, it's the fact that they're trying to say that they have nukes. And you can go through all the lists down here, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, Syria, Venezuela, North Korea. You always hear, oh my gosh, they have nuclear weapons. We're going to have to invade them. But when you realize that the nukes are fake, then you can kind of see through everything. And this is why, like, they never found weapons of mass destruction in any of these countries, but they caused mass destruction. And then they brought in banks, and then they charge people interest, and then they try to build them back. But they've already destroyed all their infrastructure. So that's a good one. Khazaria is their nationality. Zionism is their political ideology. Communism is their rule of law. And Satanism is their religion. That's because when you start to connect all this, these Bolsheviks, these scummy people, they've been doing this for a long period of time. And when you start to look into these four things right here, this is how they operate. This is why when people are like, why is this system so upside down? Well, when people are worshiping the devil because they're twisted in the head, they're going to flip everything upside down. But if people aren't aware, because most people are good-hearted people and don't believe that these people would be this twisted, then they can't understand it. So this is something for you to look into. And Char's area is also Car's area. They actually used to use a ch, like a ch, but then they changed it to kh. And this is why I said words have been changed multiple times, just like Bulgaria, and now it's Bulgaria. So think of letters. They've switched a lot of things so that people can't kind of connect the dots with this. So I wanted to bring that forward. This was an interesting one because, you're sitting there going, where's all your tax-paying dollars going to? You got people who can't have food. You got people who've lost their home. It's just, I mean, I could go on and on about how it's not America first. You got vets who are sitting on the street who just are homeless. I mean, it's twisted. And it was interesting because after World War I, a lot of vets actually revolted against the government, and the government used another part of the military and the militia against the vets because the vets said, well, we fought in the war and we're supposed to be taken care of. And then they just said, yeah, we can't really do much about that. And they arrested the vets. And that's the part people don't realize is the government has been used to go against the people. So the freedom that people have is when the government says you have that much freedom. So since 1949, the U.S. has given Israel a total, including interest, cost borne by the U.S. taxpayers of $133 billion. Israel gets all of its aid money at the start of the year rather than in quarterly installments like other countries. And then this results in the U.S. having to take out loans, and then you have to have more debt. So you see how this debt-based system continues to keep growing, and we're funding, genocides pretty much. It's sick. Then you go into the people who might say, oh, that would never happen. Well, this was 1948. This was a Swedish diplomat who basically said about how Palestine should remain Palestine, and a Zionist group decided to take him out. And this has happened many times. So when they say, like, don't question Israel, they don't want you to question it because once you start questioning it, kind of like this presentation, you're going to kind of start to understand things and then see what you're being sold. And then this was another one. You got the governor, Ron DeSantis, signs legislation in Israel further combating anti-Semitism. So basically, anti-Semitism is just disguised as questioning things. All you're doing is questioning things. This whole presentation is just questioning why our government is bought and paid for and deliberately working with another country and selling us out. That's considered, they say, anti-Semitism, which is a funny word when you think about it, because the word, even the way it's said, doesn't even make any sense. This was another interesting one. This lady was talking about how the Jewish people are the ones bringing all the migrants into Europe. And then you can kind of think of everything related to migration. You kind of start to understand things. And I can just play it if you want.
Anti-Semitism. Because at this point in time, Europe has not yet learned how to be multicultural. And I think we're going to be part of the throes of that transformation, which must take place. Europe is not going to be the monolithic societies that they once were in the last century. Jews are going to be at the center of that. It's a huge transformation for Europe to make. They are now going into a multicultural mode, and Jews will be resented because of our leading role. But without that leading role and without that transformation, Europe will not survive.
I mean, you can say grand illusion. Imagine saying that a country cannot survive unless you import a whole bunch of other people to break up the country. What's interesting is that's not happening in other countries. It's only happening in Europe and the United States. So, you have to sit there and wonder, okay, so you have to bring people in to fix us? How about we just fix the country? You don't have to bring more people into it. And that's how they create chaos and divide. And then they, change the government and make people move into different things. This was the document. People can look up the PDF, so you can look into that. This ties into the whole assassination with JFK. Many people always ask, well, what happened with JFK? Well, when you got somebody who goes against a banking system that we just described in the beginning, and then you also have somebody who was siding with Palestinians, that doesn't really float with this whole system. And the Zionists who own, the CIA and the FBI, they don't want something like that. So you go to this document next and you find the whole thing with Zionists murdering JFK. And this was a document that I found that just blew my mind. And it talked about how Kennedy was friends with the Palestinians. And then they just kind of got him removed. And this is how it goes, same with Gaddafi. You can go into all the people who get removed when they compete against the system. And here's another book that people can look into, and The Unspoken Kennedy Truth goes into everything, always about Zionists. You see right here, just all the different Zionists and things, and people, they're trying to take people out. And then when it comes to questioning Israel too, you get into the whole situation with 9/11. This was from the Sam Tripoli podcast, episode 866. Case closed with Richard Gage. I highly recommend everybody check this out because you have to wonder why the areas that were, allegedly hit with whatever it may be, we can get into that topic, but they were fireproofing those areas prior to. So if they're fireproofing, how they burn. And there's some footage on that because I like to show things. Because remember, there was a lot of gold underneath there, lots and lots of gold. And these Zionist, Bolsheviks, communists, scummy people take away the gold from the people. They really don't want people having gold because that's the only tangible asset that they can own. So if you take all the gold that was underneath the Twin Towers, you now own all the money. And they would actually take the gold from country to country. And then once they took the gold out of that country, the country would crumble. So you can kind of see how that kind of plays a role. Here's the footage.
Yeah, really. Did you see this on CNN?
So that you just get to see the demolition taking place. And that's what the fireproofing was. So, like I said, this is showing different sides so people can kind of see the different sides thing. And even Eustace Mullins talked about this, that the Zionists were responsible for 9/11. Once again, we're kind of teetering it back to the same thing.
Is it a United States government job or is it a Zionist?
Well, as far as Zionists, it's our job. Because the Zionism is the government in Washington. Everybody knows that.
And he says everybody knows that. That's the crazy part. So this isn't a conspiracy, and it's just coming up with the topic and whatever else. Everybody knows. Like we showed Nixon and all these politicians and these Muppets and all of them. They've all been bought and paid for a long time ago. They do their little, kissing the wall and all the other stuff. And this was another one too. This goes back into the bankers wrecking economies. This is the other side of World War II that's not sold. And it's interesting because when I posted up this video on Instagram, which this is a rabbi exposing this, okay, and he explains that the Jews were destroying the economy, they said that this was hate speech. Instagram said that a Jewish fellow who's a rabbi exposing the Jews of World War II is hate speech. This is how much of delusion and how much nonsense we live in. So I'm just going to play the clip.
Not about the charge interest. No more interest. Now you would think, why? What does he care about interest? Because all the people that had the money, that lent the money out, were Jews. He didn't like it. He said no more interest. Why? Because of the high interest that the Jews charged people was so high, it ruined, it destroyed the economy in Germany. They destroyed, just like they destroyed Russia. A few years before that, their communism over there, Jews destroyed Russia. Not Goyim. Jews destroyed. Communism is by Jews. Well, don't let anybody confuse you. Look at history, Karl Marx, all the other Reshaim, they're all Jews. Wicked, but nonetheless Jews. They destroyed Russia, and you read in chapter 2 of Mein Kampf, they destroyed Russia, now they're destroying Germany.
So there you go. And just right out of, the rabbi's mouth. And this is why I like to show all sides. I'm not going to just rant on my side of some information that I found. I like to show every side. And everybody should hear every side because you should be able to question everything. And then the last one was just David Cole, another Jewish fellow who exposed the whole thing with Auschwitz. And he was explaining that things happened after the war, like putting up things to make it look like they were gas chambers and things like that. They were happening after the war. And when he started questioning everybody, they started giving him the exact answers that he was originally looking for because they were put on the spot. But when they do the tours, they don't say that stuff. So this is what I said is a lot of things have been skewed and a lot of things have been changed. So here it goes.
Those the original pools in Sina, they've been rebuilt.
Yes.
Okay. After the war.
After the war. And that's the thing. So you sit there and go, well, shouldn't we be questioning all of this? Because it all leads back to the beginning. It all leads back to, people being paid and the information and all of these things. But shouldn't we be questioning all these things? I mean, that's kind of where I'm going to kind of leave it. And this whole thing is to kind of give you just another side so that you should question everything because we went through a lot in 2020, which was all lies. We went through a lot in all the different, you get through every single generation. There's always been lots of lies. So my goal with this whole presentation is for you to question things and you to think about things from a different angle. Because when they tell you not to question something, you should. And that is the part of our freedom of speech, which they're attempting to try to take away. They don't want us talking about these topics and they don't want these things being addressed because they don't want to see another side. Just like during the pandemic, when people were figuring out that viruses and germs and all of this was lies and nothing of that was actually jumping all over, but new technology of 5G and things like that, that questions the narrative. And then you can't keep selling them that they need to wear 55 masks and get 32 boosters and stand on stickers at the grocery store. The things don't add up anymore. So I hope that this can help elevate your mind and open up your mind to a different angle. Because when I went down these rabbit holes, I will never forget when I watched Europa the Last Battle and the Untold Story, the Greatest Story Untold. I was mind blown because we were lied to, like I said, in 2020, but World War II was just a whole nother one. It completely just blew my mind because that is so pushed in the school system. The school system keeps telling you, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. They make you watch movies, they have you write presentations and reports. Do you see how they're ingraining the thing of not questioning anything? They're thinking for you. And I don't believe in that. I believe that people should be able to think for themselves and they should see every angle. And if there's another angle that somebody discovers, feel free to put it out there. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And I hope that it can help open some minds. And I hope that it can lead you down some paths to really question Israel. See you next time.